You think you discarded a powerless wife, but you just created the woman who will bring your empire to its knees.
The ballroom of the Rhodes Legacy Gala glittered like a kingdom built on power and reputation. Crystal chandeliers glowed above polished marble floors. Atlanta's wealthiest executives, politicians, and investors filled the massive hall, their conversations blending with the soft hum of orchestral music. Every table shimmered with gold accents and towering white roses. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of legacy. Instead, it was about to become something entirely different. Cameras flashed from every direction. Reporters crowded near the stage, eager to capture Graham Whitmore's keynote address. As the youngest CEO to ever run Whitmore Global Holdings, Graham had built a reputation for ruthless precision in business. But the confidence he normally carried like armor was gone. A thin layer of sweat coated his forehead. His hands tightened around the microphone. Across the stage, a woman stood calmly beside the massive presentation screen. Imani Whitmore. Technically, she was no longer his wife. But tonight, she was the most dangerous person in the room. Her posture was relaxed, almost graceful. A deep emerald gown framed her figure with effortless elegance. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek style that revealed sharp, steady eyes watching the crowd. Not a single hint of panic. Not a trace of anger. Only control. The room buzzed with quiet confusion. Guests whispered behind their champagne glasses. Why was she here? The divorce between Graham and Imani had been finalized months ago. Society pages had treated it like another routine separation among wealthy families. Quiet, clean, forgettable. Yet nothing about this moment felt forgettable. Graham shifted his weight as the host attempted to regain order. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said nervously, "we seem to have a change in the program." The words barely finished leaving his mouth before Imani stepped forward. Every camera instantly swung toward her. The massive screens behind the stage flickered to life. Rows of files appeared on display. Private documents, bank transfers, text messages. Gasps rippled through the ballroom like electricity. Graham's heart began pounding so loudly it drowned out the music. "What is this?" he muttered under his breath. Imani took the microphone. Her voice carried through the ballroom with effortless clarity. "Good evening, Atlanta." The room fell silent. Hundreds of powerful people stared at her, unsure whether they were witnessing a scandal or the beginning of one. Imani paused. Her eyes moved slowly across the audience. Finally, they settled on Graham. He swallowed hard. Then she spoke. "Some men divorce you thinking you're nothing." A few people exchanged uneasy glances, only to discover they just divorced $500 million. The room erupted. Shock swept across the ballroom like thunder. One of the screens behind her shifted again. A timeline appeared. At the top, Whitmore Global Holdings. Below it, a sequence of hidden transfers, ownership structures, private shell companies, strategic investments, all connected to one person, Imani Whitmore. The whispers turned into loud murmurs. Another screen appeared. Photographs flashed. Graham entering a hotel with a woman who was not his wife. Text messages scrolled across the display. Promises. Plans. Lies. The crowd stiffened. Someone near the back dropped a champagne glass. It shattered across the marble floor. Then another slide appeared. Medical documents. A pregnancy announcement, followed by a second file labeled in bold red letters, "False report." The woman involved in Graham's affair had claimed she was pregnant. But the documents on the screen told a different story. Fabricated test results, payments from accounts linked to Graham's family. A scheme designed to pressure Imani during divorce negotiations. The ballroom exploded with noise. Journalists surged forward. Camera flashes multiplied. Graham's face drained of color. "This isn't real," he whispered. But the evidence behind him said otherwise. Imani didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The facts spoke loudly enough. "While I was being publicly blamed for the collapse of our marriage," she continued calmly, "a coordinated effort was taking place to remove me from Whitmore Global's financial structure." The next screen showed legal contracts, signed years earlier, investment agreements, silent ownership clauses, and one number highlighted in bold, $500 million, $500 million. legally tied to Imani Whitmore, a portion of Whitmore Global Graham had never bothered to understand, because he had never believed she mattered. The audience watched him closely now. The once untouchable CEO looked trapped under the weight of his own reputation. A reporter shouted from the crowd, "Mr. Whitmore, were you aware your ex-wife controlled these assets?" He opened his mouth. No words came out. Another journalist raised their microphone. "Is it true your family tried to manipulate the divorce settlement?" Graham glanced desperately toward the front table where his parents sat frozen in shock. The Whitmore dynasty had spent decades building influence across Atlanta. Tonight, that influence was crumbling in front of every major media outlet in the city. Imani stepped slightly to the side, allowing the final screen to appear. A legal filing submitted only hours earlier. Title: Whitmore Global Corporate Investigation. Gasps filled the ballroom again. Board members began whispering urgently among themselves. This was no longer a private scandal. It was a corporate disaster. Graham stared at the screen like a man watching his empire slip through his fingers. Imani looked at him one last time. Her expression remained steady, not bitter, not triumphant, simply finished. The narrator's voice finally entered the scene. Calm, measured. But this story didn't begin in a ballroom. The screen faded slowly to black. The sound of reporters shouting questions echoed in the distance. And it didn't begin with billion-dollar companies or public scandals. A quiet piano note replaced the chaos. It started somewhere much smaller. The screen reappeared. A cemetery. Gray skies above rows of headstones. Mourners dressed in black. A young woman standing beside her mother's coffin, 7 months pregnant, tears silently falling down her face. Next to her stood her husband, Graham Whitmore. He held an envelope. Cold, legal, final. The narrator spoke again, and on the worst day of her life. The envelope appeared in Imani's trembling hands. Divorce papers. Her husband handed her a future he believed would destroy her. The scene froze, the music faded, and the narrator delivered the final line of the hook. But the man who thought he was discarding a powerless wife had just set in motion the rise of the woman who would one day bring his empire to its knees. Now let me ask you something, bestie, because this story isn't just about billionaires, boardrooms, or society galas. It's about a moment that many people secretly fear. A moment where someone you trusted decides you are no longer worth standing beside. So think about this for a second. What would you do if the person who promised to protect you chose humiliation instead? What would you do if your spouse handed you divorce papers while you were standing beside your mother's coffin? Not during an argument, not after months of separation, but at the funeral, the day you're already carrying grief heavier than anything you've ever felt. Would you fight for the marriage? Would you beg them to reconsider? Would you collapse under the weight of it all? Or would you quietly walk away and build something they never believed you were capable of creating? Because the woman at the center of this story faced that exact choice, and the decision she made didn't just change her life. It eventually shook an entire corporate empire. But before we begin, bestie, I want to hear from you, because stories like this only grow when people share them. So tell me something in the comments. If someone humiliated you on the worst day of your life, what would you do? Would you walk away? Or would you prove them wrong? And while you're down there, tell me where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Before we start this unbelievable story, bestie, hit like and comment where you're watching from. It helps YouTube push stories like this to more people. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Not the gala, not the headlines, not the scandal that shocked Atlanta's elite. This story begins somewhere quieter. A cemetery on the edge of the city. The sky that morning was dull and gray, matching the heavy mood surrounding the small gathering of mourners. Black umbrellas dotted the hillside as friends and family stood in silence. At the center of the crowd stood Imani Rhodes, 28 years old, 7 months pregnant, and saying goodbye to the woman who had raised her alone, her mother. The wind tugged gently at the hem of Imani's black dress as the pastor finished his final prayer. People wiped tears from their faces. Soft sniffles drifted through the quiet air. Imani barely moved. Her hands rested protectively over her stomach. Inside, the baby shifted gently, a reminder that life continued, even when the world felt like it had stopped. Her mother had been her foundation, the person who believed in her intelligence long before anyone else noticed it. The person who worked 2 jobs so Imani could attend a better school. The person who reminded her every single day that dignity mattered more than approval. And now that voice was gone. The casket slowly lowered into the ground. A quiet sob escaped Imani's throat before she could stop it. A hand touched her shoulder. Graham Whitmore. Her husband. Tall. Sharp suit. Perfectly composed. At least on the outside. To the guests attending the funeral, Graham represented stability. He came from one of Atlanta's most powerful families. The Whitmores had influence in banking, real estate, and technology. Their name carried weight in boardrooms and charity galas alike. When Imani married him 2 years earlier, many people had quietly wondered how someone from her background had entered that world. She wasn't from old money. She didn't grow up attending elite schools. Her mother had been a public school teacher, hardworking, proud, invisible to the circles Graham moved in. But Graham had insisted their love was genuine, that none of those differences mattered, and for a while, Imani believed him. The pastor stepped aside as mourners began placing white roses on the coffin. Imani remained frozen. Her chest tightened with grief. Graham leaned closer. "We should talk," he said quietly. His tone felt strangely distant, not comforting, not gentle. Imani wiped her eyes and nodded faintly. "Okay." He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, pulled out a large envelope, and placed it in her hands. For a second, she didn't understand. Her mind was still wrapped in mourning, still processing the finality of the burial. But the weight of the envelope felt wrong. Too stiff, too formal. She opened it slowly. The first page slid out. Her eyes scanned the bold legal header. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The words didn't make sense. Not at first. Then her heart dropped. Divorce. A low ringing filled her ears. Imani looked up at him. The man she had built her life around. The father of the child growing inside her. Her voice barely formed a whisper. "Graham, what is this?" His jaw tightened. "This is the cleanest way to handle things." "Handle things?" Her chest tightened. "Handle what?" He glanced around the cemetery, clearly uncomfortable with the location. "My parents think it's better if we finalize this quickly." The words landed harder than the cold wind cutting across the hillside. "Your parents, not us, not our marriage, not the baby. His parents." Imani stared at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any sign of regret. She found none. "Today?" she asked softly. "You're giving me divorce papers today?" He shifted slightly. "This isn't about timing. It's about practicality." Practicality. The word echoed in her mind with quiet cruelty. Around them, mourners continued placing flowers beside her mother's grave, unaware that another kind of loss was happening only a few feet away. Imani's fingers trembled slightly as she lowered the papers. "You waited until my mother's funeral." Graham exhaled. "It's better to get it done before the baby arrives." The baby. He said it like a scheduling conflict. Not a life. Not a family. A small group of guests began walking toward them to offer condolences. Imani quickly folded the papers and slipped them back into the envelope. Her face went still. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just quiet. Because something important was happening inside her. A realization forming slowly. The man she thought she married had never truly respected her. To him, she had been convenient, acceptable, temporary. And now that his family disapproved of the marriage, she was simply being removed. But Graham had made one mistake. A mistake that would take years for him to fully understand. Because the woman standing beside that grave was not weak. She was grieving. She was hurt. But she was also far more capable than anyone in the Whitmore family realized. And the humiliation he delivered on that gray afternoon would eventually ignite a chain of events that no one in Atlanta's elite circles saw coming. The narrator's voice softened. "So if someone handed you divorce papers at your lowest moment, would that be the end of your story? A pause, or the beginning of something far greater?" The screen slowly faded to the next scene, where the real journey begins, long before the Whitmore name entered her life. Before the gala scandals, the boardrooms, and the headlines, Imani Rhodes belonged to a very different Atlanta. Not the polished skyline of Buckhead penthouses, not the private country clubs where Graham Whitmore grew up shaking hands with investors. Her story began several miles south, in Atlanta's West End, a neighborhood where history lived in brick houses, church bells, and front porches filled with conversation, where the air on Sunday mornings carried the scent of fresh biscuits and pressed suits, where people didn't measure worth by bank accounts, they measured it by character. Imani's childhood home sat on a quiet street, lined with magnolia trees and aging oak branches that stretched across the road like protective arms. The house itself wasn't large. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a small living room where sunlight poured through lace curtains every afternoon. But inside those walls lived something far more valuable than luxury: stability, discipline, purpose. And at the center of it all was Loretta Rhodes, Imani's mother. Loretta had raised her daughter alone. No inherited wealth, no powerful connections, just a relentless belief that education and self-respect could carry a person further than privilege ever could. Every morning began the same way. The alarm clock rang at 6. Loretta was already awake. Coffee brewing, radio humming softly with gospel music. By the time Imani shuffled into the kitchen rubbing sleep from her eyes, breakfast was already waiting. Oatmeal, toast, sometimes eggs if the week had been good financially. Loretta believed routines built strong people, and she treated motherhood like the most important responsibility she would ever hold. Finish what you start, she often told Imani. Respect yourself first. The rest will follow. Imani absorbed those words the way children absorb sunlight, naturally, without realizing how deeply they were shaping her. Weekends in the West End carried their own rhythm. Neighbors knew each other by name. Kids rode bikes up and down the street, while adults sat on porches exchanging stories about work, family, and faith. The Rhodes house often became a gathering place. Loretta's cooking had that effect on people. Her fried chicken and sweet cornbread could bring half the block through the door. Laughter filled the living room while old soul music played in the background. Those moments gave Imani something many wealthy families struggled to provide: community. Everyone looked out for each other. If a neighbor's car broke down, someone helped fix it. If a child struggled in school, another parent stepped in with tutoring. No one pretended life was easy, but everyone believed in standing together. Sunday mornings were sacred. Imani and Loretta dressed carefully for church. Pressed dresses, polished shoes. The walk to New Hope Baptist Church took 15 minutes. During that walk, Loretta always held Imani's hand. The church itself stood proudly on the corner of Oak Street. Red brick, tall white doors. Inside, the sanctuary came alive with voices raised in song. Choir robes swayed as gospel harmonies echoed through the high ceilings. For young Imani, church wasn't just religion. It was education. The elders spoke about resilience, about dignity, about carrying yourself with quiet strength, even when the world underestimated you. After services, people gathered outside under the Georgia sun. Hugs, conversations, children running across the grass. Loretta used those moments to remind Imani where she came from. "Never forget these people," she said once, as they walked home. "They're the reason we stay strong." Imani nodded seriously. She understood even then that her mother was teaching lessons deeper than words. West End Atlanta was not a place where wealth arrived easily, but it was a place where self-respect was non-negotiable. Loretta made sure her daughter carried that principle everywhere she went. School nights were structured. Homework came first. Television came later. Loretta checked every assignment carefully, not because she doubted Imani's intelligence, but because she wanted excellence to become a habit. "You don't have to prove anything to the world," she told her, "but you do owe yourself your best effort." By the time Imani reached high school, her reputation had already formed. Teachers described her as focused. Neighbors described her as respectful. Church members described her as wise beyond her years. But none of those people knew the quiet foundation beneath her discipline. Every lesson she carried had come from the woman who raised her. Loretta Rhodes didn't just teach her daughter how to survive. She taught her how to stand tall without arrogance, how to move through life with dignity, no matter who stood in front of her. Years later, when Atlanta's wealthiest executives would whisper about Imani Whitmore with disbelief, they would assume her strength appeared suddenly. They would believe success had transformed her. But the truth was far simpler. That strength had been growing since childhood, in a modest house in the West End, raised by a woman who understood something the powerful often forget. Respect doesn't come from status. It comes from how you carry yourself when no one is watching. And Imani Rhodes had been learning that lesson her entire life. If you asked most people in the West End about Loretta Rhodes, they would describe her the same way. Hardworking, dependable, quiet, the woman who kept everyone's numbers straight, the one who helped small businesses survive when their finances became confusing. But very few people truly understood how sharp Loretta Rhodes's mind really was. By day, she ran a modest bookkeeping service from a small office tucked inside the Rhodes house. A wooden desk sat beside the living room window. Stacks of folders lined the shelves. Local barbershops, small restaurants, church committees, beauty salons. They all trusted Loretta to handle their financial records. She never advertised. Word spread naturally. Business owners appreciated two things about her: accuracy and honesty. Loretta believed numbers told the truth about everything. If a company was growing, the numbers revealed it. If a business was struggling, the numbers exposed it. And Loretta had a rare ability to read those patterns quickly. Clients would sometimes sit across from her desk while she reviewed their ledgers. She didn't just calculate totals. She asked questions. Why did supply costs jump this month? Have you considered renegotiating that contract? What's your plan if revenue drops next quarter? Many business owners left those meetings surprised. They expected a bookkeeper. Instead, they received strategic advice that often saved their businesses. But when the workday ended and the last client left, Loretta's real passion quietly began. Every night after dinner, once Imani finished her homework, Loretta opened a worn leather notebook. Inside were pages filled with handwritten notes, company names, stock symbols, market trends, financial observations. While most people watched television to relax, Loretta studied the stock market. She followed financial news with intense focus. Not casually, methodically. The television in the living room often displayed business channels instead of entertainment shows. Imani would sometimes glance up from her schoolwork as charts and financial discussions filled the screen. At first, she didn't understand much of it. But Loretta noticed her curiosity. One evening, she pulled a chair beside her daughter. "Let me show you something," she said. She pointed at the television. "See that line moving up and down?" Imani nodded. "That's a company's stock price. It tells you how much people believe in that company." "Why does it change so much?" Imani asked. Loretta smiled slightly. "Because people change their minds." From that moment forward, those nightly study sessions became part of their routine. Loretta explained financial concepts with patience: how companies grow, how investments work, why money behaves differently depending on how you use it. But she also taught something deeper: independence. "You should never depend on someone else to control your financial future," Loretta said one night while marking notes in her ledger. Imani listened carefully. "Even if you marry someone wealthy?" Loretta looked up from the notebook. Her expression remained calm but firm. "Especially then." She closed the notebook slowly. "Money creates power in relationships. If only one person understands it, that person controls the outcome." Imani absorbed those words silently. They would stay with her long after childhood ended. Loretta's investment strategy was careful. She never chased quick profits. She studied companies patiently: technology firms, infrastructure projects, logistics companies expanding across the Southeast. When she believed in something, she invested slowly. Small amounts at first, then more as confidence grew. Over time, those investments began quietly multiplying. No one in the neighborhood noticed. Loretta didn't brag. She didn't change her lifestyle. The Rhodes house stayed exactly the same. Same kitchen table, same modest car in the driveway. But inside her financial accounts, something powerful was forming. A portfolio built through discipline and patience. More importantly, Loretta involved Imani in those decisions. Every few weeks they reviewed the investments together. Loretta would ask questions: "What do you think about this company? Do you see why their growth matters?" Imani learned how to analyze information instead of reacting emotionally. Numbers became a language she could understand. And with that language came confidence. One evening, while reviewing financial reports, Loretta shared a lesson that would guide Imani for the rest of her life. She closed the ledger and leaned back in her chair. People think wealth has to announce itself, she said calmly. Big houses, loud cars, fancy parties. Imani smiled slightly. Like the people on TV? Loretta nodded. Yes, but those things don't always mean strength. She tapped the notebook gently. The loudest wealth is usually the weakest. Imani frowned slightly. What do you mean? Loretta's eyes softened. Real wealth doesn't need attention. It grows quietly. It moves carefully. And by the time people notice it, she paused. It's already too strong to ignore. Imani looked down at the numbers in front of her. At that moment, she didn't fully realize what her mother was preparing her for. But those lessons were building something powerful inside her. Financial knowledge, patience, and the ability to move through powerful spaces without announcing her intentions. Years later, when the Whitmore family underestimated her, when Graham assumed she was simply a supportive wife, they would unknowingly step into the very trap Loretta Rhodes had spent decades preparing her daughter to avoid. Because behind Imani's calm demeanor lived the education of a woman who understood wealth better than most corporate executives ever would. A woman whose greatest investment had always been her daughter. While Imani Rhodes grew up surrounded by community, discipline, and quiet wisdom in Atlanta's West End, Graham Whitmore III was raised in a world where influence arrived before effort. His childhood unfolded hundreds of miles away in Connecticut, inside a family whose wealth stretched across generations. The Whitmore estate sat on several acres of perfectly maintained land. A long stone driveway curved past manicured gardens before arriving at a towering colonial mansion framed by tall white columns. Inside those walls lived tradition. Portraits of Whitmore ancestors lined the hallways. Bank founders, senators, industrial investors. Their names carried influence in financial circles long before Graham was born. From the moment he could walk, Graham was taught one lesson above all others. Whitmore's belonged at the top. His education followed a carefully planned path. Private preparatory schools, exclusive summer programs, networking events disguised as social gatherings. By the time Graham reached adolescence, he understood how to speak the language of wealth. Not just money, but status. At school, he wore tailored uniforms while classmates discussed family investments and international travel plans. Weekends often revolved around country clubs, where powerful families gathered over golf, wine tastings, and quiet business negotiations. Children like Graham learned early that friendships in those spaces often became business partnerships later in life. His father, Graham Whitmore II, treated legacy like a sacred responsibility. Every dinner conversation eventually circled back to the same topic. The Whitmore name is an institution, he would say firmly. It must always remain protected. His mother, Evelyn Whitmore, reinforced that message through social expectations, charity galas, cultural foundations, elite art auctions. She believed reputation was as valuable as financial capital. People don't just watch what you do, she often reminded her son. They watch who you stand beside. Those lessons shaped Graham deeply. He learned to be confident in rooms full of powerful people, to make decisions quickly, to assume authority. But those same lessons also created blind spots, because in the Whitmore world, success followed a predictable pattern. Old money married old money. Prestige reinforced prestige. The system protected itself. When Graham eventually moved to Atlanta to help expand Whitmore Global Holdings, he carried those assumptions with him. The company's southern expansion had been his father's strategic vision. Atlanta's growing technology sector offered massive investment opportunities. Graham quickly established himself in the city's elite business circles. Boardrooms welcomed him. Investors respected his last name. And Atlanta's social scene opened its doors. But nothing in Graham's carefully structured world prepared him for Imani Rhodes. When they first crossed paths, she was nothing like the women his parents expected him to marry. She wasn't from a wealthy family. She didn't attend private academies in New England. She didn't come with inherited connections. Her background came from West End Atlanta, from church gatherings, from a mother who balanced bookkeeping ledgers at a kitchen desk while quietly studying financial markets at night. To Graham, that difference initially felt refreshing. Imani spoke with clarity. She challenged his ideas without hesitation. She asked questions no one in his social circle ever asked. For the first time in years, conversations with someone felt genuine. But when Graham introduced her to his parents, their reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The Whitmores hosted the meeting at their Atlanta penthouse overlooking the city skyline. Crystal glasses, white linen tablecloth, the kind of formal dinner designed to quietly evaluate a guest. Imani arrived wearing a simple navy dress, elegant, confident, respectful. Loretta Rhodes's lessons about dignity were visible in every movement she made. Evelyn Whitmore noticed it immediately. The composure, the intelligence in Imani's eyes. But instead of admiration, Evelyn responded with quiet calculation. Throughout dinner, the questions came politely, yet every word carried weight. "And where did you attend school, dear?" Evelyn asked with a polite smile. "Georgia State University," Imani replied calmly. Graham's father raised an eyebrow slightly. "A practical choice," he said. The conversation continued. Questions about her work, her family, her upbringing. None of the comments were openly hostile. But beneath the politeness lived a clear message. She did not belong in their world. When Imani stepped onto the balcony later that evening, Graham's parents exchanged a glance. His father spoke first. "You cannot be serious about this woman." Graham frowned. "She's brilliant." "That's not the issue." Evelyn folded her hands carefully. "Marriage in families like ours carries consequences." "What does that mean?" "It means alignment," his father said. "Background, reputation, shared expectations." Graham's jaw tightened. "You're talking about class?" His father didn't deny it. "She doesn't come from our world." Graham stared toward the balcony, where Imani stood looking out over the city lights. "That doesn't make her less capable." Evelyn's voice softened. "No one said she was incapable." Another pause. "But there are social realities you cannot ignore." What they didn't say directly hung in the air between them. Race, class, perception. Atlanta's elite circles were more complicated than Graham wanted to admit, and his parents understood exactly how those dynamics worked. But Graham believed something different. For the first time in his life, he felt drawn to someone not because of status, but because of who she was. What he didn't realize was that underestimating Imani Rhodes would become the single most expensive mistake of his life, not because she lacked the qualities his parents valued, but because she possessed strengths none of them had bothered to recognize. And one day, those strengths would challenge the very empire the Whitmore family had spent generations building. Before the betrayal, before the divorce papers at the cemetery, before the public scandal that would one day shake Atlanta's corporate elite, there was love. Real love, or at least something that felt powerful enough to change both their lives. Graham Whitmore first truly noticed Imani during a charity fundraising event in downtown Atlanta. The ballroom buzzed with conversation as donors and executives gathered to support an education initiative aimed at improving resources for public schools across the city. Graham attended partly out of obligation. Whitmore Global sponsored several philanthropic programs, and appearances like this helped maintain the company's public reputation. He moved easily through the crowd. Handshakes, polished introductions, short conversations about business expansion. Everything felt familiar, predictable, until he heard someone challenge a speaker during a panel discussion. The moderator had just finished praising corporate donors when a calm voice spoke from the audience. "But what happens after the donation?" The room quieted slightly. Imani Rhodes stood near the back of the hall. Her posture was composed, her tone respectful but firm. "Money helps," she continued, "but long-term support matters more. Are these companies creating mentorship programs too? Or only writing checks?" The panel hesitated. Several executives exchanged glances. Graham found himself watching her closely. Most people at events like this avoided challenging questions, but she didn't seem concerned with social comfort. She was interested in solutions. After the panel ended, Graham approached her near the refreshment table. "That was bold," he said. Imani looked up from her drink. Her expression remained calm. "Honesty isn't bold, it's necessary." Graham smiled slightly. "Most people here disagree. Most people here aren't the ones affected by those programs." The conversation could have ended there, but something about her directness intrigued him. Instead of moving on to the next networking opportunity, Graham stayed. They talked about education reform, urban development, economic inequality in Atlanta. The discussion moved easily between serious topics and lighter moments. Imani's intelligence became impossible to ignore. She didn't just speak with conviction. She supported her arguments with knowledge. At one point, Graham laughed softly. "You realize you're the only person here who isn't trying to impress me." Imani raised an eyebrow. "Should I be?" "Most people do." She shrugged slightly. "That sounds exhausting." The honesty made him laugh again. By the end of the evening, Graham felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Curiosity, not about business opportunities, about a person. Their next meeting happened by accident, or at least Graham pretended it was. He invited her to coffee under the excuse of continuing their conversation about the education program. That meeting turned into dinner. Dinner turned into long evening walks through Midtown. Conversations stretched late into the night. They talked about childhood experiences, about ambition, about the pressure Graham felt carrying the Whitmore name. Imani listened carefully without judgment. One evening, while sitting outside a quiet restaurant after closing time, Graham admitted something he rarely shared. "Everyone assumes my life is easy." Imani studied him quietly. "Is it?" He shook his head slowly. "Everything is expected. Success isn't optional. Every decision gets evaluated through the lens of legacy." "Sounds lonely." The word surprised him. No one had ever described his situation that way before. But she was right. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "You're the first person who talks to me like I'm just human." Imani tilted her head slightly. "Aren't you?" Graham smiled. "Sometimes it doesn't feel that way." The city lights reflected softly off nearby buildings. For a moment, the world felt simpler than it usually did. Graham looked at her with genuine appreciation. "You make me feel human again." Imani didn't respond immediately, but a quiet warmth appeared in her eyes. Their relationship deepened quickly after that. They introduced each other to different parts of Atlanta. Imani showed him neighborhoods filled with culture, history, and community he had barely noticed before. Church festivals, local restaurants, community events filled with music and laughter. Graham introduced her to the corporate world he navigated daily. Business dinners, art galleries, networking receptions. At first, the cultural contrast seemed exciting rather than difficult. They learned from each other, adapted, shared perspectives. Friends began noticing the connection. "She challenges you," one colleague told Graham. He nodded. "That's why I like her." But not everyone viewed their relationship with the same optimism, especially within the Whitmore family. Because while Graham experienced their romance as something refreshing, his parents saw something very different. A disruption, a relationship that ignored the carefully structured expectations they believed protected their family's legacy. And the deeper Graham's feelings for Imani grew, the more determined they became to stop it. But love has a way of ignoring warnings, especially when two people believe their connection is strong enough to overcome anything. Neither Graham nor Imani realized yet that powerful forces were already moving quietly around them. For now, their world still felt full of possibility. A connection built on honesty, respect, and the belief that love could bridge any difference. The storm that would eventually test that belief had not yet arrived. For a time, it seemed as if love had proven stronger than expectation. Despite the Whitmore family's hesitation, Graham moved forward with his decision. He was going to marry Imani Rhodes. Their wedding took place in Atlanta during a warm spring weekend, when the city felt alive with blooming magnolias and sunlight reflecting off glass towers downtown. Unlike the grand ceremonies Graham's parents preferred, the couple chose something balanced between both of their worlds. The ceremony was held in a historic chapel not far from Midtown. The guest list blended two very different circles. On one side of the aisle sat executives, investors, and social figures connected to the Whitmore legacy. Tailored suits, quiet conversations about market trends, measured smiles. On the other side sat the people who had watched Imani grow up. Neighbors from the West End, church members from New Hope Baptist, teachers, cousins, childhood friends. Their laughter filled the space with warmth. The contrast was impossible to miss. Yet, when Imani walked down the aisle, none of that seemed to matter. She wore a classic ivory gown, elegant but understated. Loretta Rhodes walked beside her daughter proudly, her eyes shining with both joy and caution. When Graham saw Imani reach the altar, his usual composure softened. For a moment he forgot about the expectations surrounding him, forgot about his parents' concerns. All he saw was the woman who had challenged his perspective on life, the woman who had shown him a world beyond corporate boardrooms and social status. They exchanged vows that afternoon with sincerity, not promises shaped by legacy, but promises shaped by belief in each other. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, applause filled the chapel. The celebration afterward reflected both sides of their lives. A lively reception took place at a downtown venue overlooking the Atlanta skyline. Music blended gospel influences with jazz and contemporary songs. Imani's community brought energy to the dance floor. Even some of Graham's reserve colleagues eventually joined the celebration. For that evening, at least, the two worlds coexisted peacefully. The early months of their marriage felt full of possibility. Graham continued leading expansion efforts for Whitmore Global Holdings, which meant frequent travel between Atlanta and New York. Board meetings, investment conferences, strategic partnerships. Imani often joined him when schedules allowed. Those trips exposed her to the fast-moving world of corporate influence. She observed quietly, studied conversations, listened to how decisions were made behind polished conference tables. Her financial instincts, sharpened by years of learning from Loretta, helped her understand far more than many executives realized. During evenings after long workdays, Graham and Imani explored the cities together. In Atlanta, they attended cultural festivals, charity galas, and community events. In New York, they walked through art galleries, visited late-night cafes, and discussed their ambitions. Their relationship continued to revolve around conversation, ideas, possibility. Graham found himself relying on her perspective more often than he expected. "You see angles my team misses," he admitted once after she analyzed a potential investment. Imani smiled lightly. "That's because I'm not thinking about protecting reputations." Her independence impressed him, but the balance between their two worlds required effort. Some social gatherings connected to Whitmore Global felt uncomfortable for Imani. Certain guests treated her politely but with quiet distance. Conversations sometimes paused when she joined a group. The subtle signals were easy to notice. Graham dismissed those moments at first. "They just need time to adjust," he reassured her. Imani nodded. Yet something inside her remained observant. Loretta's lessons had taught her to pay attention when environments revealed hidden attitudes. And in those polished rooms filled with powerful people, she occasionally sensed a quiet resistance. Meanwhile, the Whitmore family continued observing from a distance. Evelyn Whitmore rarely confronted her son directly after the wedding. Instead, she began influencing matters through subtle methods. Invitations to exclusive family gatherings that arrived late, social events scheduled during times when Imani had prior commitments, comments framed as casual observations. "She seems strong-willed," Evelyn mentioned during one private conversation with Graham. "That's one of the reasons I married her," he replied firmly. His father approached the situation differently. Graham Whitmore II focused on business influence. He occasionally hinted that leadership roles inside Whitmore Global required maintaining the right public image. "A CEO's spouse becomes part of the company's brand," he remarked during a strategic discussion. The implication lingered, even if Graham refused to acknowledge it. Despite these undercurrents, life moved forward. Graham believed the tension would fade as time passed. And for a while, it seemed possible, because inside their home, their marriage remained strong. They continued sharing ideas, planning long-term goals, imagining a future where their combined strengths could shape something meaningful. But the seeds of tension planted by his parents had not disappeared. They were simply waiting for the right moment to grow. The moment that changed everything began with what was meant to be a joyful gathering. A Sunday dinner, the kind of family tradition that often reveals more than people expect. Imani suggested hosting the evening at the Rhodes house in the West End, the same home where she had grown up under Loretta's guidance. She wanted both families present for the announcement. Graham agreed, believing the occasion might help ease the quiet distance between the Whitmores and the Rhodes family. That Sunday afternoon, the house filled with familiar energy. Loretta moved confidently through the kitchen, preparing a meal large enough to feed everyone comfortably. The aroma of seasoned chicken, collard greens, and freshly baked cornbread drifted through the rooms. Members of the Rhodes family arrived first. Cousins, aunts, family friends from church. They greeted Graham warmly, treating him like someone still earning his place, but welcomed nonetheless. Their laughter filled the house quickly. Soon the doorbell rang again. This time the visitors arrived with a different presence. Evelyn Whitmore entered first, dressed in a refined cream suit that reflected her usual elegance. Behind her stood Graham Whitmore II, his posture formal and observant. The difference between the two families became immediately visible. The Rhodes household radiated warmth and familiarity. The Whitmores carried quiet formality, yet Loretta greeted them respectfully. "Welcome," she said calmly. "Dinner will be ready shortly." Everyone gathered around the large dining table that had served generations of Rhodes family conversations. The seating arrangement itself told a subtle story. Rhodes relatives filled one side with easy conversation. Whitmore parents sat opposite them, maintaining polite smiles. Graham and Imani took seats near the center. The meal began with gratitude. Loretta offered a short prayer before everyone started serving food. For a while the dinner felt peaceful. Stories were shared. Questions about work and travel circulated around the table. Eventually, Graham noticed Imani watching him quietly. He recognized that look. She was ready. Imani set down her fork gently. "I wanted both families here today for a reason," she said. The room grew quiet. Everyone turned toward her. Graham reached for her hand under the table. Imani smiled softly. Then she spoke. "I'm pregnant." For half a second, silence filled the room. Then the road side of the table erupted with excitement. Gasps, applause, joyful shouts. One of Imani's cousins nearly knocked over a glass while jumping up to hug her. Loretta's eyes filled with tears of happiness. "My grandbaby," she whispered, standing to embrace her daughter. The energy in the room became electric. People celebrated loudly. Jokes started flying about baby names and future family gatherings. Across the table, the Whitmores responded differently. Evelyn Whitmore smiled politely. Her hands clapped softly. "That's wonderful news," she said carefully. Her husband nodded once. A child certainly brings responsibility. The contrast in reactions was impossible to ignore. Imani noticed it immediately, but she kept her composure. Graham squeezed her hand reassuringly. Later that evening, as dinner dishes were cleared and guests began drifting into the living room for dessert, Loretta approached her daughter quietly. They stepped outside onto the front porch where the evening air felt cooler. Streetlights illuminated the quiet neighborhood. Inside the house, laughter continued as family members talked excitedly about the future baby. Loretta leaned against the railing and studied her daughter carefully. "You look happy," she said gently. "I am." Loretta nodded slowly, but something thoughtful appeared in her expression. "You need to stay aware." Imani frowned slightly. "Of what?" Loretta glanced toward the house where the Whitmore parents remained inside. Different families carry different expectations. Imani crossed her arms lightly. "Graham loves me. I know he does." Loretta's voice remained calm. "But love doesn't erase pressure." Imani listened silently. Her mother had always spoken carefully when offering advice. Loretta rested her hand over Imani's. "You're entering a chapter where power and money will influence decisions around you. I've seen that already." "Yes," Loretta said quietly. "But a child changes the stakes." Imani looked down at her stomach instinctively. "What are you trying to tell me?" Loretta met her eyes directly. "You must always protect your independence." Imani hesitated. "You think they'll try to control things?" Loretta didn't answer immediately. Instead, she repeated a lesson she had taught many times before. The loudest wealth is usually the weakest. The words carried deeper meaning now, because Loretta understood something her daughter was only beginning to notice. The Whitmore family valued legacy above all else, and a child connected to that legacy could become more than just a source of joy. It could become a source of influence. As the sounds of celebration drifted from inside the house, Loretta squeezed Imani's hand once more. "Just remember who you are," she said softly. Imani nodded. At that moment she believed she understood her mother's warning, but she had no idea how important those words would soon become. Because, within months, The pressure surrounding her marriage would grow far stronger than either of them expected. Life had begun to feel full for Imani Rhodes Whitmore. Her pregnancy was progressing smoothly. The first months had been filled with careful doctor visits, quiet planning, and the joyful anticipation that surrounds new life. Graham had even begun discussing nursery designs in their Atlanta home. For a brief period, the tension between families faded into the background. Imani focused on preparing for motherhood, and Loretta seemed more energized than ever about becoming a grandmother. She often placed her hand gently on Imani's stomach during visits. "I'm going to spoil this baby," she joked one afternoon. Imani laughed. "You already spoil me." Loretta smiled warmly. "That's my job." But beneath the humor, Loretta remained the same observant woman she had always been. She continued monitoring her investments, continued managing her bookkeeping clients, continued watching the financial world with quiet interest. Her evenings were still spent reviewing company reports and market movements at the kitchen table. That routine had never changed, and neither had her advice to Imani. "Stay independent," she reminded her daughter during one conversation. "Marriage should never replace your ability to stand on your own." Imani listened respectfully, though she believed her mother's caution might be unnecessary. Despite the small tensions with Graham's parents, her marriage still felt solid. Graham still spoke about their future, still discussed building something meaningful together. But fate rarely announces its arrival before it changes everything. The call came on a Thursday evening. Imani had just returned home from a doctor's appointment when her phone rang. The number belonged to one of Loretta's neighbors from the West End. Imani answered casually. "Hello?" The voice on the other end sounded shaken. "Imani, it's Miss Jenkins." Imani straightened slightly. "Yes, Miss Jenkins. What's wrong?" There was a pause. "Your mother collapsed this afternoon." Imani's breath caught. "What?" She was working at her desk. One of her clients stopped by and found her on the floor. The room around Imani felt suddenly distant. "Is she at the hospital?" "Yes. Grady, Memorial." Imani didn't even remember grabbing her purse. She moved automatically. Keys, phone, car, every thought in her mind focused on one thing. Her mother. The drive to the hospital felt endless, even though it lasted less than 20 minutes. Traffic lights blurred together. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. When she reached the emergency department, nurses directed her to a waiting room. A doctor approached within minutes. His expression revealed the answer before he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "Your mother experienced a severe heart condition." The words barely reached her ears. "We tried everything we could." Silence filled the hallway. Imani stared at him without blinking. She was fine this morning," she whispered. The doctor nodded softly. Sometimes these conditions develop without warning. The reality settled slowly, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Loretta Rhodes was gone, just like that. The woman who had shaped every part of Imani's life, the woman who had built strength inside her, was suddenly no longer there. Grief arrived in waves. Friends from the West End quickly gathered around her once the news spread. Church members visited the hospital. Neighbors called with condolences. The Rhodes community moved together during moments like this, but nothing could soften the emptiness Imani felt. Her pregnancy made the loss even heavier. Every time the baby moved inside her, she remembered the excitement Loretta had shown about becoming a grandmother. That future had disappeared overnight. The days leading up to the funeral passed in a blur. New Hope Baptist Church prepared to host the service, the same sanctuary where Loretta had worshipped for decades, where she had raised her daughter to understand faith, discipline, and dignity. Word of her passing spread across the neighborhood quickly. By the morning of the funeral, the church parking lot overflowed with cars. People lined the sidewalks outside. Former clients, church members, old students whose parents Loretta had helped financially. The impact of her quiet life became visible in that moment. Inside the sanctuary, the atmosphere carried deep sorrow, but also respect. The choir sang softly as guests entered. White flowers surrounded the front of the church. At the center stood Loretta's casket. Imani sat in the front row wearing a simple black dress. Her pregnancy was now impossible to hide. 7 months along. The child inside her moved gently, as if sensing the heaviness in the room. Graham sat beside her. His expression remained serious. supportive on the surface, yet distant in a way Imani couldn't fully understand. Behind them sat members of the Whitmore family. Evelyn Whitmore maintained her usual composed posture. Graham Whitmore II watched quietly. Their presence felt formal rather than emotional. In contrast, the Rhodes community filled the church with genuine grief. People shared stories during the service, how Loretta had helped manage their finances when businesses struggled, how she had guided young people toward college, how she had offered wisdom without expecting recognition. One elderly woman approached the podium with tears in her eyes. Loretta believed in people, she said, even when they didn't believe in themselves. The congregation responded with quiet murmurs of agreement. Imani listened silently. Each story revealed another piece of her mother's influence. A life lived without wealth or status, yet filled with impact. When the choir finished their final song, the pastor stepped forward to close the service. Loretta Rhodes taught us that dignity doesn't depend on circumstance, he said. She showed us how quiet strength can change lives. Imani lowered her head as tears rolled down her cheeks. The church slowly emptied afterward. Mourners followed the hearse toward the cemetery. Atlanta's gray sky matched the somber mood of the procession. No one present realized that the most painful moment of the day had not yet happened, because the funeral itself was only the beginning of the betrayal that would soon define this chapter of Imani's life. The cemetery sat on a quiet hill outside Atlanta. Rows of headstones stretched across the landscape beneath a cloudy sky. Family and friends gathered around the open grave, where Loretta Rhodes would soon be laid to rest. The air carried a stillness that often accompanies final goodbyes. Imani stood closest to the casket. Her hands rested gently over her stomach. The child inside her shifted again. 7 months pregnant, grieving, exhausted, yet trying to remain strong. The pastor spoke softly as the final prayer began. Around her stood the people who had loved her mother. Neighbors, church members, relatives. They formed a quiet circle of support. Graham stood beside her in a dark suit. His posture remained composed, but his attention seemed divided. His eyes occasionally drifted toward the edge of the gathering where several unfamiliar figures stood. One of them was a young woman with long blonde hair. Her name was Brielle Carter. She worked within Whitmore Global's marketing division. Most of the Rhodes family didn't recognize her, but Graham knew exactly why she was there. A few feet away stood his parents, Evelyn Whitmore and Graham Whitmore. The second observed everything carefully. Their presence felt distant from the genuine mourning around them. The pastor finished the prayer. May Loretta Rhodes rest in peace. The casket slowly descended into the earth. Several mourners wiped tears from their faces. Imani's chest tightened as she watched the final movement. The moment felt unreal. Her mother's voice, her guidance, her steady presence, gone. For several seconds, she couldn't move. The wind rustled through the nearby trees. Guests began placing white roses near the grave. One by one, quiet gestures of farewell. Imani remained still until Graham gently touched her arm. "We should talk," he said quietly. His tone carried a strange formality. Imani looked up at him. Now, she expected words of comfort, perhaps reassurance. Instead, Graham reached into his suit jacket and removed a sealed envelope. The paper looked thick, official, legal. He placed it in her hands. Confusion crossed her face. What is this? Several nearby guests noticed the exchange. Whispers moved through the small crowd. Imani opened the envelope slowly. Inside were several documents. Her eyes scanned the first page. The bold legal heading stood out immediately. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The world seemed to stop. She read the words again, hoping she misunderstood. But the meaning remained clear. Divorce. At her mother's funeral, her voice trembled slightly. "Graham, what are you doing?" He shifted uncomfortably. "This is the best time to handle things." The statement stunned everyone close enough to hear it. Gasps moved through the group. One of Imani's aunts stepped forward. "Excuse me?" Graham kept his voice controlled. "My parents and our legal team believe it's better to finalize this before the baby arrives." The cruelty of the timing became impossible to ignore. Imani's hands trembled slightly as she held the papers. Her eyes slowly lifted toward the edge of the gathering. That's when she saw Brielle clearly for the first time. Standing quietly, watching. Everything suddenly made sense. The whispers. The rumors she had tried to ignore in recent weeks. The late-night meetings Graham claimed were business obligations. Imani looked back at her husband. So this is why. Graham avoided her gaze. This situation has become complicated. Behind him, Evelyn Whitmore remained silent. Her expression revealed no sympathy, only observation. Imani's chest tightened again, not just from grief, but from the realization unfolding before her. The man she married had chosen this moment deliberately, the worst day of her life, the day she buried her mother, and the child inside her kicked again. A small movement that reminded her of the future she now faced alone. The Rhodes family watched in disbelief. Some whispered angrily. Others simply stared. The humiliation unfolded in full view of everyone present. Imani looked down at the papers again. For a long moment she said nothing. Then something inside her shifted. The pain remained, but the shock began transforming into something quieter. Something controlled. She reached into her purse. Removed a pen. Several people gasped again. Her cousins stepped forward. Imani, you don't have to do this right now. But Imani raised her hand gently, stopping her. She looked directly at Graham. For the first time that afternoon, her voice sounded steady. You chose today. He nodded stiffly. Yes. Imani signed the first page. Then the next. And the next. Each signature echoed through the silent gathering like a declaration. When she finished, she folded the papers carefully and handed them back to him. You're free, she said quietly. Graham looked almost relieved. He accepted the documents quickly, but he didn't notice the change in her eyes. The calm, the composure, the same quiet strength Loretta Rhodes had spent decades building inside her daughter. Because Graham Whitmore believed he had just removed a complication from his life, what he failed to understand was that he had just created the most powerful turning point of Imani's story. And one day, the decision he made beside that grave would cost him far more than he ever imagined. The cemetery remained quiet, long after the final shovels of soil settled over Loretta Rhodes's grave. Most of the mourners were still standing in disbelief. They had arrived expecting to honor a respected woman from their community. Instead, they had just witnessed something else entirely, a moment that would linger in people's memories long after the funeral ended. Imani stood motionless for several seconds after handing the signed papers back to Graham. The wind moved gently across the hillside. Her black dress shifted slightly as she breathed slowly, carefully controlling the storm of emotions inside her. Grief for her mother, shock from the betrayal, and the weight of humiliation unfolding in front of people she had known her entire life. But Loretta's lessons had always been clear. Dignity first, no matter the circumstance. Across the gathering, whispers had already begun spreading. Some relatives stared openly at Graham. Others turned their attention toward the unfamiliar woman standing several feet away, Brielle Carter. Until that moment, she had remained quietly near the edge of the group, her presence easy to overlook among the mourners. But now everyone was beginning to understand why she was there. She stepped forward slowly. Her posture carried a strange mixture of confidence and discomfort. Graham noticed immediately and moved slightly closer to her. The gesture did not go unnoticed. A murmur passed through the Rhodes family. One of Imani's cousins spoke under his breath. So that's her. Imani followed their gaze. Her eyes settled on Brielle for the first time with full clarity. Brielle looked younger than she expected. Elegant, carefully styled, the kind of appearance designed to fit easily within corporate social circles. Their eyes met briefly. Brielle held the look for only a moment before shifting her attention toward Graham. The message was obvious. The replacement had already been chosen. Graham cleared his throat quietly, as if preparing to address the uncomfortable tension surrounding them. But Brielle spoke first. Her voice was soft but audible enough for several people nearby to hear. I didn't want it to happen like this. The words felt rehearsed. Imani tilted her head slightly. Like what? Brielle hesitated. Then she placed a hand gently over her own stomach. The gesture was subtle, yet unmistakable. I'm pregnant. The sentence landed like a second shock wave. Several members of the Rhodes family gasped. A few people turned toward Graham with open disbelief. Imani did not react immediately. Her expression remained calm, controlled. But inside, the final pieces of the situation settled into place. The late nights, the growing distance, the sudden urgency surrounding the divorce. It had never been about compatibility. It had been about replacement. Graham shifted uncomfortably as the silence thickened. "We didn't plan for things to happen this way," he said quietly. The explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears. Across the small gathering, Evelyn Whitmore finally stepped forward. Her expression remained composed. "Given the circumstances," she said calmly, "our family believes it is best for everyone to move forward." The phrasing carried the same calculated politeness she always used. But the meaning was unmistakable. The Whitmore family had already chosen their side. Imani looked directly at Evelyn. So this was the plan. Evelyn didn't deny it. Life sometimes requires difficult decisions. The words felt colder than the wind moving across the cemetery. Graham Whitmore II remained silent beside his wife, though his posture suggested agreement. To them, the situation appeared simple. The Whitmore legacy required stability, a child from the family's preferred future, a relationship that aligned with their expectations. And Brielle Carter, unlike Imani Rhodes, fit their world comfortably. Several members of the Rhodes family were no longer hiding their anger. Voices rose quietly in protest. "This is shameful. At a funeral? How could he do this to her?" But Imani raised her hand gently. The gesture stopped them. She turned back toward Graham. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Two people who had once believed their connection could overcome anything. "You made your choice," she said quietly. Graham swallowed. "Yes." Imani nodded once. Then she glanced briefly toward Brielle again. "Congratulations," she said calmly. The word carried no bitterness, no sarcasm, just distance. That calm reaction unsettled Graham more than anger would have, because he suddenly realized something. Imani wasn't fighting him. She wasn't begging. She wasn't even arguing. She was simply leaving. She placed one last white rose beside her mother's grave. Then she turned away from the gathering. The Rhodes family immediately moved toward her, surrounding her with quiet support. No dramatic confrontation followed. No shouting, just a quiet exit filled with dignity. As she walked away from the cemetery, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells from somewhere in the distance, and the narrator's voice entered the story again. Some betrayals are loud, but the most powerful responses are silent, because the people watching that moment believed they had just seen a woman lose everything: her husband, her marriage, her future inside one of Atlanta's most powerful families. But what none of them realized was that the woman walking away from that grave was carrying something far more valuable than the Whitmore legacy, and she hadn't discovered it yet. Before we continue this unbelievable story, bestie, I want to hear your thoughts. CTA second. If someone humiliated you publicly like this, would you forgive them later? Comment below, because what happens next will change everything. The days after the funeral passed quietly. Too quietly. Imani returned to the Rhodes house in the West End, the same home where she had spent her entire childhood. The rooms felt different now. Every corner carried memories of Loretta. The kitchen table where she studied financial reports. The living room where church members once gathered for Sunday meals. Even the small desk beside the window still held neatly stacked folders from her bookkeeping clients. Nothing had been disturbed since the day Loretta collapsed. Imani moved slowly through the house during those first few days. Her pregnancy made every movement deliberate. The grief came in waves. Sometimes it arrived while she was making tea, other times while folding laundry. Simple tasks suddenly triggered memories. Her mother's voice, her advice, her quiet confidence. Friends from the neighborhood visited regularly. Church members brought food. Neighbors checked in to make sure she wasn't alone. But once the visitors left each evening, the house became silent again. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork from Loretta's desk, Imani noticed something unusual. A small envelope tucked beneath a stack of financial folders. Her name was written neatly across the front. Imani. The handwriting belonged to her mother. Her heart tightened as she opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter. Simple, direct, If you're reading this, it means something has happened to me. Go to First National Bank downtown. Safe deposit box 417. Everything you need to understand is inside. Imani stared at the letter for several seconds. Her mother had never mentioned any safe deposit box. Curiosity mixed with confusion. The next morning, she drove downtown. First National Bank stood in the center of Atlanta's financial district. Tall glass windows reflected the skyline. Inside, the atmosphere felt quiet and professional. Imani approached the reception desk. "I'm here to access safe deposit box 417, she said. The bank manager checked the records carefully. "Yes, Ms. Rhodes," he confirmed after a moment. "You are listed as the authorized beneficiary." The statement deepened her confusion. Loretta had planned this. The manager escorted her to the secure vault area. Heavy steel doors. Rows of small locked compartments. He retrieved the box and placed it in a private viewing room. Then he left her alone. Imani sat slowly and opened the container. Inside were several thick folders, legal documents, property deeds, investment portfolios. Her breathing slowed as she began reading. The first folder contained records from brokerage accounts, company shares purchased years earlier, technology firms, logistics corporations, infrastructure development groups. Some of the companies had grown dramatically over the past decade. The account values were astonishing. She opened the next folder. More documents, real estate holdings, apartment buildings, commercial properties, locations across Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas. Each property had been purchased through carefully structured partnerships. Quiet investments. No public announcements. The third folder contained financial summaries, compiled and updated over many years. Imani's eyes widened as she reached the final page. At the bottom of the document sat a single number. $500 million, $500 million. Her hands trembled slightly. The number had to be wrong. She read it again. Every investment, every property, every account, combined together, her mother's quiet financial empire, built piece by piece through patience and intelligence. Imani leaned back in the chair slowly. The room suddenly felt very still. All those evenings Loretta spent studying market reports, all those lessons about independence, about quiet wealth. Her mother had not simply been preparing her daughter emotionally, she had been preparing her financially, and she had left everything to Imani. The realization settled slowly. While Graham Whitmore believed he had removed a powerless wife from his life, the woman he discarded now controlled resources that rivaled major corporate fortunes. Imani closed the folders carefully. Tears filled her eyes again, not just from grief, but from understanding. Loretta's final gift wasn't just money. It was freedom, the freedom to stand on her own, the freedom to build something even greater. And for the first time since the funeral, a quiet sense of possibility replaced the pain, because the woman Graham Whitmore believed he had erased had just discovered she was far more powerful than anyone ever imagined. The private viewing room at First National Bank remained silent, except for the faint hum of air conditioning. Imani sat alone at the small table, surrounded by the folders that had just changed her understanding of everything. Investment portfolios, property holdings, financial statements that revealed the quiet empire Loretta Rhodes had built over decades. $500 million. The number still felt unreal. But as she slowly organized the documents back into the safe deposit box, her hand paused. At the very bottom of the container sat another envelope. Different from the short note that had sent her to the bank, this one was thicker, more deliberate. Her mother's handwriting appeared across the front again. "For my daughter." Imani's throat tightened. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a long handwritten letter, several pages filled with Loretta's familiar script. For a moment, Imani hesitated. Reading it would make the loss feel even more real. But she needed to know what her mother had wanted her to understand. She unfolded the first page and began reading. "My sweet girl, if you are holding this letter, it means I'm no longer there to explain these things to you myself. And that thought alone hurts more than you will ever know. But I want you to remember something before anything else. You were always the greatest investment of my life." Imani's vision blurred with tears as she continued. "I know the world you married into. Families like the Whitmores believe power comes from status. from money that announces itself, from people who expect the world to recognize their importance. But real strength rarely behaves that way. Real strength moves quietly. It studies, it prepares, and it waits. Imani turned to the next page slowly. The words felt like her mother was speaking directly beside her. I began investing when you were still a child, not because I wanted wealth, but because I wanted protection. Protection for you. I watched how the world treats women who depend on someone else's power, and I refused to let that happen to my daughter. Memories rushed through Imani's mind. All those evenings at the kitchen table, Loretta studying financial reports, writing notes inside worn notebooks, teaching her about companies, markets, and independence. Those moments had been more than lessons. They had been preparation. You probably wondered why I never changed our lifestyle, why we stayed in the same house, why I never talked about the investments. It's because money attracts attention, and attention invites interference. Quiet growth is harder to stop. Imani wiped tears from her cheeks before continuing. The world will try to measure you by many things: your background, your race, your marriage, your mistakes. But none of those define your worth. Your strength comes from your mind, your discipline, and your ability to stand when others expect you to fall. She reached the final page. The handwriting looked slightly shakier near the bottom. There is one last piece of advice I want you to carry with you. Never waste energy trying to prove yourself to people who have already decided who you are. They will not change, and their opinions will not build your future. Instead, focus on building something so powerful that the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Never argue with someone who thinks you're small. Rise quietly. Imani lowered the letter slowly. The room felt still again, but the grief she carried now felt different, not lighter, but steadier. Loretta's voice lived inside every sentence, inside every investment decision she had made, inside the quiet empire she had left behind. The letter wasn't just an explanation. It was a blueprint, a final lesson from a woman who had prepared her daughter for a moment exactly like this. Imani folded the pages carefully and placed them back into the envelope. Then she gathered the financial documents again. For the first time since the funeral, her mind felt clear. Graham Whitmore believed he had removed her from his world. But the truth was far more complicated, because the woman he discarded was no longer the same person who had stood beside him at the graveside. She now understood the scale of what her mother had built, and more importantly, what she herself was capable of becoming. The transformation did not happen overnight. Grief still lived inside the Rhodes house. Some mornings Imani woke expecting to hear her mother moving through the kitchen. Other days she reached for the phone before remembering there would be no answer. But Loretta's letter had given her something powerful: direction. Instead of letting sorrow consume her, Imani began studying the financial empire her mother had left behind. She spent long hours reviewing documents, investment histories, property management agreements, partnership contracts. The more she studied, the more impressed she became with Loretta's discipline. Every decision showed patience, careful research, long-term thinking. These weren't random investments, they were strategic, and they had been growing quietly for years. But managing a fortune of that scale required expertise. So Imani made her first major decision. She assembled a financial advisory team, not the type of advisors who chased attention. She chose professionals known for discretion: a seasoned investment strategist from Atlanta, a real estate asset manager with experience across multiple states, a corporate attorney specializing in complex ownership structures. During their first meeting, the advisors arrived expecting to guide a grieving heir who might not fully understand the scale of her inheritance. Instead, they encountered someone who had been studying financial strategy since childhood. Imani asked precise questions about portfolio diversification, about tax efficiency, about long-term asset preservation. By the end of the meeting, the advisors realized something. They weren't managing her wealth. They were helping execute her vision. And that vision quickly expanded beyond personal investments. One of the first initiatives she announced surprised them all: the creation of the Rhodes Legacy Foundation, named in honor of Loretta. Its mission reflected the values that shaped Imani's upbringing: educational access, community investment, financial literacy programs for young entrepreneurs. The foundation began partnering with Atlanta schools and nonprofit organizations almost immediately. Scholarship programs were established for students pursuing finance and business degrees. Workshops taught families how to manage savings and investments. The same knowledge Loretta had quietly mastered was now being shared with entire communities. But philanthropy was only one part of Imani's plan. The investment side of the empire continued expanding. Using the capital Loretta had built, Imani began acquiring major equity stakes in emerging companies, technology startups, logistics networks expanding across the Southeast, infrastructure projects linked to transportation and energy. Unlike investors chasing publicity, she operated quietly, strategically. Her advisors executed transactions through carefully structured partnerships. Ownership stakes grew across multiple industries, and with each acquisition, Imani's influence increased. Within 2 years, financial analysts across Atlanta began noticing a pattern. A new investor was appearing repeatedly in major deals. A name that had rarely appeared in corporate headlines before. Imani Rhodes, not Whitmore. Rhodes. The choice was intentional. She had returned to the name that represented her true foundation. Inside financial circles, curiosity grew. Who was this investor quietly acquiring stakes in high-growth sectors? Why had her presence appeared so suddenly? Few people connected her to the divorce scandal that had briefly circulated through Atlanta's social pages. And those who did underestimated the significance of what they were witnessing, because the same calm discipline Loretta had practiced now defined her daughter's leadership. Imani rarely attended flashy industry events. She preferred private strategy meetings, focused discussions about long-term opportunities. Her advisors often described her style in one word: patient. But patience did not mean hesitation. When she believed in an opportunity, she acted decisively. One logistics firm struggling with expansion funding received an unexpected investment offer. Within months, the company doubled its operations. A renewable energy startup gained access to capital that allowed it to expand across 3 states. Imani's influence continued spreading through sectors that shaped the region's economic future. And slowly, something remarkable happened. Executives began requesting meetings with her, not because of her former marriage, but because of her investment decisions, because the quiet investor from Atlanta's West End was demonstrating extraordinary judgment. Meanwhile, life outside the financial world continued moving forward. Imani eventually gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The moment she held him for the first time, she understood something her mother had always believed. Legacy wasn't only about wealth. It was about what you built for the next generation. She named him Nathaniel Rhodes Whitmore, honoring both sides of his heritage, but making sure the Rhodes name stood first. As the years passed, the Rhodes Legacy Foundation expanded its programs across multiple cities. Students who received scholarships wrote letters describing how their lives had changed. Families attended financial literacy seminars that helped them build savings for the first time. And the investment empire continued growing quietly behind the scenes. By the time Atlanta's corporate leaders finally realized the scale of Imani Rhodes's influence, it was already too late to underestimate her, because the woman who once stood silently beside her mother's grave had become one of the most powerful investors in the region. And the empire she was building would soon intersect again with the very company that believed it had removed her from its future, Whitmore Global Holdings. The stage for that confrontation was already being prepared, even if Graham Whitmore had no idea yet. For a long time after the divorce, Graham Whitmore believed the worst of the situation was behind him. The cemetery scene had been uncomfortable, publicly awkward, but in his mind, it was still manageable. Atlanta's elite social circles had seen far worse scandals involving powerful families. Affairs, divorces, quiet settlements. None of it usually lasted long in the news cycle. Whitmore Global Holdings remained strong. The company controlled major investments across technology, logistics, and infrastructure. Share prices held steady. Expansion plans continued. From the outside, the Whitmore empire still appeared secure. But inside the company's executive floors, subtle shifts were beginning to appear. The first sign came during a quarterly board meeting at Whitmore Global's headquarters in downtown Atlanta. The conference room overlooked the skyline through floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Senior executives and board members sat around the long polished table reviewing financial projections. Graham stood confidently at the front of the room, presenting updates on several expansion projects. His voice remained steady. Charts and forecasts filled the screens behind him. At first, the meeting seemed routine. Then one of the board members raised a question. "Before we proceed with the infrastructure expansion," said Martin Keene, one of the company's oldest directors, "we need to address something." Graham paused. "What specifically?" Keene folded his hands carefully. "The recent media attention surrounding your personal life." The room grew noticeably quieter. Several executives exchanged quick glances. Graham maintained a controlled expression. "My personal matters have no impact on corporate performance." Keene nodded slowly. "That may be true internally." He tapped a folder on the table. "But investors view leadership stability as part of corporate value." Another board member spoke next. The divorce story spread through several financial publications. A third voice joined in. "And there are questions about the circumstances." Graham's jaw tightened. "What questions?" The director slid a printed article across the table. The headline read, "Whitmore CEO faces scrutiny after controversial divorce." The article summarized rumors that had circulated quietly through Atlanta's business circles. The funeral incident, the sudden appearance of Brielle Carter, speculation about overlapping timelines. None of it had been proven publicly, but corporate markets rarely waited for proof before forming opinions. Perception mattered, and perception had begun shifting. Graham closed the article calmly. "This is gossip." "Gossip still affects investor confidence," Keene replied. He leaned forward slightly. "Our responsibility is protecting the company's long-term reputation." The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Most of the board members avoided direct accusations, but their concern was clear. The Whitmore brand had always been built on stability, discipline, control, and Graham's personal decisions had begun introducing uncertainty. Outside the boardroom, similar conversations were unfolding among investors. Financial analysts who followed Whitmore Global began asking subtle questions during earnings calls. Journalists covering corporate leadership requested interviews about the company's future direction. Even longtime partners began watching carefully. No one openly challenged Graham's leadership yet, but the foundation beneath him was beginning to move. Meanwhile, Brielle Carter's presence in Graham's life became increasingly visible. She appeared beside him at charity functions, corporate dinners, high-profile social events. At first, the couple seemed confident, but the public reaction remained mixed. Atlanta's business community valued discretion, and many executives privately questioned Graham's judgment. One evening after a corporate reception, Graham's father addressed the situation directly. They sat together in the Whitmore family's Atlanta penthouse, overlooking the city lights. "You've created unnecessary attention," Graham Whitmore II said firmly. Graham exhaled. "I handled the divorce legally." "That's not the point." His father stood beside the window. "A leader cannot appear impulsive." Graham remained silent. His father continued. "Investors want predictability." Another pause. "Right now, they're questioning it." For the first time since the divorce, Graham felt a flicker of concern. Because if board members began doubting his leadership, the Whitmore empire could shift in ways he never expected. And outside the company walls, another problem was quietly forming. One that would soon threaten far more than his reputation. At first, Brielle Carter appeared perfectly suited for the role she had stepped into. Elegant, well-spoken, comfortable in elite social environments. The Whitmore family believed she represented the kind of partner Graham should have chosen from the beginning, especially after she announced her pregnancy. The news had been presented to the Whitmores shortly after the divorce. Brielle explained the situation with careful emotion. She claimed she and Graham had grown close while working together at Whitmore Global. Their relationship had developed quietly, and the pregnancy had simply accelerated the need for Graham to end his marriage. The story aligned conveniently with what the Whitmore parents wanted to believe. A new beginning. A new heir connected directly to their legacy. Evelyn Whitmore welcomed Brielle into family events with polite approval. "She understands our world," Evelyn remarked during one private conversation. But months passed, and small inconsistencies began appearing. The first concerns came from within the Whitmore household itself. Evelyn had always believed in careful observation. Details mattered, and Brielle's pregnancy seemed strangely difficult to verify. She rarely attended doctor appointments with Graham. She often claimed scheduling conflicts, or said the visits had already occurred earlier in the day. At first, Graham accepted these explanations without question, but Evelyn noticed something else. Brielle's physical condition never seemed to change. Her clothing choices remained the same. Her figure showed no clear signs of pregnancy progression. By the 4th month, Evelyn's curiosity turned into suspicion. She contacted a physician friend privately, not to confirm medical records, those were protected, but to ask general questions. How early do visible changes typically appear? Evelyn asked during a quiet lunch meeting. Her friend answered honestly. For most women, signs begin showing by the 2nd trimester. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. That evening, she reviewed several family photographs from recent events. Brielle looked exactly the same in each one. No physical difference. The suspicion deepened. At the same time, a separate issue began surfacing inside Whitmore Global's financial department. One of the company's internal auditors noticed unusual transfers connected to a personal account associated with Brielle Carter. The payments were not corporate funds. They came from a private source, but the amounts were significant, and they were arriving regularly. The discovery raised enough curiosity that the auditor mentioned it casually to Celeste Whitmore. Celeste was Graham's younger sister and a financial analyst within the company's internal investment division. Unlike her parents, Celeste had always maintained a sharper, more independent perspective on family matters. She listened carefully as the auditor explained the transfers. "Where are the funds coming from?" she asked. The auditor pointed to the report. "A consulting firm in New York." Celeste studied the name. It sounded unfamiliar. After running a deeper search, she discovered something unexpected. The consulting firm had no visible client base. Its primary financial activity involved sending payments to Brielle Carter. Large payments. Regular payments. Celeste leaned back slowly in her chair. Something about the pattern felt wrong. She requested additional financial documentation quietly. Within days, another detail surfaced. The consulting firm had connections to an investment account, partially controlled by Evelyn Whitmore. Celeste stared at the screen in disbelief. Her own mother appeared linked to the financial arrangement supporting Brielle. The implications were troubling. Either Evelyn was helping Brielle financially, or she was paying her for something. That night, Celeste drove to her parents' penthouse without warning. Evelyn greeted her calmly. "Unexpected visit." Celeste walked straight into the living room. "We need to talk." Evelyn noticed the seriousness immediately. "What about?" Celeste placed the financial report on the table. "These transfers." Evelyn glanced at the page. Her expression remained neutral. "Where did you find that?" Celeste crossed her arms. "The better question is why Brielle Carter is receiving payments from an account connected to you." Silence filled the room. For several seconds, Evelyn said nothing. Then she exhaled slowly. "Some situations require management." Celeste's eyes widened. "You paid her?" Evelyn met her daughter's gaze calmly. "I ensured the situation aligned with the family's future." The explanation sent a chill through Celeste. "Mom, is she even pregnant?" Evelyn did not answer immediately, and that hesitation revealed everything, because the lie that had helped remove Imani Rhodes from the Whitmore family was beginning to collapse, and once the truth surfaced, it wouldn't just damage Brielle Carter. It would expose the manipulation behind the entire betrayal, a betrayal that Graham Whitmore still believed had secured his future. The first cracks in Graham Whitmore's world appeared quietly, not through dramatic confrontations, not through sudden financial collapse, but through something far more dangerous for a man in his position: distance. The type of distance that spreads slowly through professional networks and social circles once confidence begins to fade. At Whitmore Global Holdings, the atmosphere inside the executive offices had shifted noticeably since the board meeting that questioned his leadership. Graham still held the title of CEO. He still entered meetings with the same tailored suits and polished confidence that had defined his public image for years. But the subtle signals around him had changed. Executives who once sought his approval now seemed more cautious in conversation. Board members scheduled additional review meetings for major investment decisions, Large shareholders began requesting more detailed reports about corporate governance. None of these actions directly challenged his authority, but together they created pressure that Graham could not ignore. The rumors surrounding his personal life had become impossible to contain. Financial journalists began referencing the situation in broader articles about corporate leadership, the funeral incident, the divorce, the sudden appearance of Brielle Carter. The narrative spreading through media outlets was damaging, not because it exposed illegal behavior, but because it suggested poor judgment. And in the world of high finance, poor judgment could erode investor confidence quickly. Inside Whitmore Global's boardroom, conversations grew increasingly direct. During one strategy session, Martin Keene addressed the issue again. "Our partners are asking questions," he said calmly. "Questions about stability." Graham leaned back in his chair. "I've already explained that my personal life does not affect corporate operations." Keene nodded. "But perception still shapes investment decisions." Another board member spoke next. "There are concerns about leadership focus." Graham's patience began wearing thin. "Are you suggesting I'm not capable of managing this company?" "No," the director replied carefully. "But we are responsible for protecting shareholder value." The words lingered long after the meeting ended. Meanwhile, Graham's relationship with Brielle had also begun deteriorating. The early excitement surrounding their relationship faded quickly once the pressures of public scrutiny intensified. Brielle had initially enjoyed the attention that came with being connected to Whitmore Global's CEO, exclusive events, luxury travel, social recognition, but she had not expected the constant tension that followed. Media speculation, family scrutiny, corporate gossip. Their private conversations became increasingly strained. Graham often returned home late after dealing with corporate issues. Brielle complained that he seemed distant. "You barely talk to me anymore," she said one evening inside their Atlanta penthouse. Graham rubbed his temples tiredly. "I'm dealing with a lot right now. That doesn't mean you can ignore me." He exhaled slowly. "Brielle, the company is under pressure. So am I." The argument continued until both of them eventually fell silent. Neither of them mentioned the deeper issue hovering between them, the pregnancy, because despite months passing since the announcement, Brielle's condition remained difficult to explain. And Graham had begun noticing the same inconsistencies his mother observed earlier. Doctor appointments were always postponed. Medical records were never shared. Questions received vague answers. The doubts grew stronger each week. One evening, he finally confronted her directly. "Why haven't I seen any medical updates?" Brielle looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "Every appointment seems to happen without me." She crossed her arms defensively. "You're busy." That's not an explanation. The tension in the room thickened. Brielle looked away. "I don't like hospitals." Graham stared at her. The answer felt weak, and somewhere deep in his mind, a quiet suspicion began forming. But even as his personal life deteriorated, another reality was emerging outside his control. Because the woman he once dismissed had not disappeared quietly. Imani Rhodes had been building something powerful. Within financial circles, her name now appeared frequently in discussions about emerging investment leaders, major equity acquisitions, strategic partnerships, expansion across multiple industries. Executives began referencing her investment decisions during corporate briefings, and each time Graham heard her name mentioned, a strange discomfort settled in his chest. Because the story spreading through Atlanta's financial community was very different from the one he remembered. In those discussions, Imani Rhodes was no longer described as his former wife. She was described as a major investor, a strategist, a leader, and slowly, the realization began settling in. While his world was losing stability, hers was growing stronger. The final confirmation arrived during another board meeting. An analyst presented a report about regional investment activity. Several new players had entered the Southeast market. One name appeared prominently in the data: Rhodes Capital Group. Martin Keene glanced toward Graham. "You're familiar with that name, I assume?" Graham said nothing, but the isolation he felt in that moment was impossible to ignore. Because for the first time since the divorce, he understood something clearly. Imani Rhodes had not simply moved on with her life. She had risen, and the higher she climbed, the more his own decisions began to look like catastrophic mistakes. Atlanta's social calendar featured many prestigious events throughout the year: charity auctions, corporate fundraisers, cultural celebrations, but none of them generated the level of anticipation surrounding the announcement that arrived one spring afternoon. The Rhodes Legacy Foundation Gala. The invitation appeared in the inboxes of executives, philanthropists, political leaders, and media organizations across the city. It was described as a fundraising event supporting educational initiatives and community investment programs. But what truly captured attention was the host, Imani Rhodes. By that time, her reputation had expanded far beyond quiet investor circles. Her foundation had funded scholarships across multiple states. Her investment group had become involved in several high-profile infrastructure projects, and the financial media had begun describing her as one of the most influential emerging investors in the Southeast. Naturally, curiosity about the gala grew immediately. The event would be held at one of Atlanta's largest luxury ballrooms, the same type of venue typically reserved for corporate summits and international conferences. Preparations took months. Professional event planners coordinated every detail: elegant decor, custom lighting, a stage large enough to host presentations and performances. When the evening finally arrived, more than 500 guests filled the venue. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers reflecting soft gold light across polished floors. Tables were decorated with white roses and crystal centerpieces. Camera crews from several media outlets lined the back wall. Journalists waited to capture images of the city's most powerful figures arriving. The guest list included an extraordinary range of attendees: corporate executives, tech founders, philanthropic leaders, political representatives, even several well-known celebrities with ties to Atlanta's growing entertainment industry. But one set of invitations generated particular interest. The Whitmore family had been invited as well. When the invitation arrived at Whitmore Global's headquarters weeks earlier, Graham stared at it silently. The elegant card carried the Rhodes Legacy Foundation logo embossed in gold lettering. For several seconds he debated whether attending would be wise, but declining the invitation could create its own set of questions. So he accepted. The evening of the gala arrived with unusual tension. Limousines lined the street outside the venue as guests stepped onto the red carpet. Photographers captured every arrival. Inside the ballroom, soft orchestral music filled the air while servers circulated with champagne. Excitement buzzed through the crowd. Many guests were eager to see Imani Rhodes in person. Her public appearances remained rare. Most people knew her only through business reports and foundation announcements. When Graham entered the ballroom with his parents, the atmosphere shifted slightly. Several guests noticed immediately. Whispers moved through the crowd, because everyone present understood the history between the Whitmore family and the woman hosting the event. A few minutes later, the lights dimmed gently. Conversations quieted. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for the Rhodes Legacy Foundation Gala." Applause echoed through the ballroom. The host continued speaking about the foundation's mission: educational opportunity, community investment, financial empowerment. Then he smiled toward the side of the stage. "And now, please welcome the woman whose vision made all of this possible." The spotlight shifted. Imani Rhodes stepped forward. The room fell silent. She wore a deep emerald gown that reflected the stage lights beautifully. Her posture carried the same calm confidence that had defined her throughout the evening. But tonight, something else surrounded her. Authority, not the kind borrowed from family legacy, but the kind earned through discipline and leadership. Applause filled the ballroom as she approached the microphone. Graham watched from across the room. For a brief moment, the memories of their past returned. But the woman standing on that stage no longer belonged to his world. She had built her own, and everyone present could feel it. The applause that welcomed Imani Rhodes to the stage gradually softened as she stepped closer to the microphone. 500 guests filled the ballroom. Corporate executives, foundation leaders, media representatives, investors. Many of them had arrived expecting an inspiring speech about philanthropy. Few realized they were about to witness something far more significant. Imani allowed the room to settle into silence before she began. "Good evening," she said calmly. Her voice carried easily through the hall. "Tonight is about the Rhodes Legacy Foundation and the work we've been able to accomplish for communities across this region. Several guests nodded in agreement. Large screens behind the stage illuminated with images from foundation programs, students receiving scholarships, community financial workshops, urban education projects. The audience applauded politely as she spoke about opportunity and investment in future generations. For several minutes, the speech followed exactly what everyone expected. Then her tone shifted slightly. "But before we continue celebrating tonight," she said, "there is something important I need to address." The audience grew still again. Across the room, Graham Whitmore felt his shoulders stiffen. Something about the way she spoke made the air feel heavier. Imani continued calmly, "Many of you know that my life has changed significantly over the past few years." She paused briefly. Some of those changes happened very publicly. Several guests exchanged curious looks. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the presentation screens behind her changed. A single slide appeared. A timeline. The first date displayed corresponded with a Whitmore Global corporate event held 3 years earlier. Imani spoke again. "This timeline shows a sequence of events that began long before my marriage ended." A second image appeared. Photographs taken at company functions, corporate dinners, executive meetings. In several of those images, Graham Whitmore stood beside Brielle Carter. The audience leaned forward. Whispers began spreading quietly through the room. Imani maintained her calm tone. "At the time, I believed these interactions were professional." Another slide appeared. Text message records, meeting logs, travel confirmations. The pattern forming on the screen became unmistakable. The relationship between Graham and Brielle had begun long before the divorce. A ripple of shock moved through the ballroom. Graham felt every eye turning toward him. Imani continued speaking without raising her voice. "Affairs are painful," she said simply, "but they are not uncommon." Another slide appeared. Financial documents, bank transfers, private consulting payments. The room grew quieter. "These transactions," she explained, "originated from accounts connected to members of the Whitmore family." More murmurs spread across the audience. Imani allowed a brief pause before continuing. "The purpose of these transfers was not business development." The next screen revealed the final piece: medical documents, test results, official verification from independent physicians. At the top of the document appeared a clear statement: "No pregnancy detected." Gasps filled the ballroom. Several journalists raised their phones immediately. Camera flashes erupted. Imani spoke again with the same controlled tone. "The pregnancy used to justify my divorce." She glanced briefly toward Graham across the room. "Never existed." The revelation landed with the force of a thunderclap. Guests began whispering loudly. Some executives looked stunned. Others stared directly at Graham. Because the implications were now obvious. The affair had been concealed. The divorce had been manipulated. And the pregnancy that helped justify the public humiliation at Loretta Rhodes's funeral had been fabricated. Imani did not show anger. She simply allowed the evidence to remain visible on the screens. "For a long time," she continued, "I considered keeping this information private." Her voice remained steady, but silence often protects the wrong people. The room listened intently. "My mother taught me that truth eventually finds its way into the light." She paused briefly, and tonight felt like the right moment to allow that truth to speak for itself. Across the ballroom, Graham felt the ground beneath his reputation collapse quietly. Board members from Whitmore Global stood near the back of the room. Several investors exchanged grim expressions. This was no longer a personal scandal. It had become a corporate crisis. Imani looked around the audience calmly. This evening was organized to celebrate education, community investment, and financial independence. Her gaze moved briefly toward the Whitmore table. "But accountability also matters." She stepped slightly away from the podium. "The evidence you see tonight speaks for itself." Silence filled the ballroom. Then the reactions came all at once. Shocked conversations erupted across the room. Journalists hurried toward the exits to file breaking stories. Investors began making urgent phone calls. And the Whitmore name, once associated with stability and influence, now stood at the center of a rapidly expanding scandal. Yet Imani did not appear triumphant. She simply returned to the microphone. "Tonight is not about revenge," she said quietly. It is about truth. The room slowly settled again. Because in that moment, everyone understood something clearly. The woman who had once been humiliated publicly at her mother's graveside had just reclaimed her narrative in front of the most powerful audience in Atlanta. Before we continue, bestie, I want to hear what you think. CTA third. Do you think exposing the truth publicly was justice or revenge? Comment below, because what happened next was just as dramatic. The aftermath of the Rhodes Legacy Gala unfolded quickly. By the next morning, news of the event had spread across national business media. Articles detailed the evidence presented during Imani Rhodes's speech. Financial analysts questioned Whitmore Global's leadership. Corporate governance experts debated how such a situation could have developed within a company known for strict oversight. For the Whitmore family, the response was immediate. Public appearances stopped. Charity events once attended regularly by Evelyn Whitmore quietly removed her name from guest lists. Social invitations faded. The Atlanta elite understood the damage attached to association with scandal. Behind closed doors, Whitmore Global's board moved swiftly. Emergency meetings were held within 48 hours. Shareholders demanded answers. Reputation had always been central to the company's value. And now that reputation had been compromised. A week later, the announcement arrived. Graham Whitmore III would step down as CEO. The official statement described the decision as a leadership transition designed to stabilize the company's future. But within financial circles, everyone understood the truth. Trust had collapsed. Graham left the headquarters building quietly the following day. No press conference, no farewell speech, just a private exit through the underground parking garage. Brielle Carter disappeared even faster. Within days of the gala, she vacated the Atlanta penthouse she had shared with Graham. Reports later indicated she had relocated to another state entirely. The financial arrangements that once supported her quietly ended. And without the protection of the Whitmore name, her presence in Atlanta's social circles vanished. Meanwhile, the Whitmore parents withdrew almost completely from public life. Evelyn Whitmore resigned from several charitable boards. Graham Whitmore II reduced his appearances at corporate events. The family that once stood at the center of Atlanta's elite society now lived largely out of sight. For many observers, the change felt sudden, but for those who understood power dynamics, it made perfect sense. Reputation had always been the Whitmores' greatest asset. Once that reputation fractured, the social structure surrounding them shifted instantly. Across the city, conversations about the scandal slowly faded as new stories captured public attention. But one name remained firmly established in Atlanta's financial landscape: Imani Rhodes. Her foundation continued expanding its educational initiatives. Her investment portfolio kept growing, and the quiet strength her mother had taught her remained visible in every decision she made. Because the woman who once walked away from a cemetery carrying humiliation and grief had transformed that moment into the beginning of a legacy far greater than anyone expected. The rhythm of Imani Rhodes's life changed again when her daughter arrived. After years filled with corporate negotiations, media attention, and the emotional aftermath of betrayal, the moment she first held her newborn child felt completely different from anything that had come before. Quiet, personal, sacred. Imani named her Nia Rhodes. The name carried deep meaning. In Swahili, it represented purpose. And for Imani, the name symbolized the new direction her life had taken. The hospital room in Atlanta felt filled with warmth as members of the Rhodes family gathered to meet the baby. Her aunts stood near the bed smiling proudly. Cousins passed around balloons and flowers. Friends from New Hope Baptist Church arrived with meals and small gifts. The same community that had supported Imani through her mother's passing and the public humiliation at the cemetery now surrounded her with genuine joy. Loretta Rhodes was not there to hold her granddaughter, but her presence still felt close. Every lesson she had taught, every moment of strength she had instilled in her daughter, all of it lived quietly in the room as Imani looked down at the tiny child resting in her arms. "You're going to grow up knowing exactly who you are," she whispered softly. Life with a newborn brought a new kind of responsibility: late-night feedings, early mornings, moments where exhaustion mixed with happiness. Despite managing a growing investment portfolio and leading the Rhodes Legacy Foundation, Imani refused to let work distance her from motherhood. She reorganized her schedule carefully. Foundation meetings happened during specific hours. Investment calls were scheduled around Nia's routine, and whenever possible, she worked from the Rhodes house in the West End. Returning to that home had been an intentional decision. The neighborhood still carried the same sense of community Loretta had always valued. Neighbors checked in regularly. Church members stopped by with meals. Children, who once played on the street, now visited just to see the baby. One afternoon, Ms. Jenkins, the same neighbor who had called Imani the day Loretta collapsed, arrived carrying a small handmade blanket. "She would have loved this little one," Ms. Jenkins said warmly. Imani nodded, smiling gently. "She already does." Because in many ways, Nia represented the continuation of everything Loretta believed in. Strength, independence, family. As months passed, Imani began bringing Nia to community events connected to the Rhodes Legacy Foundation. At first, the appearances were brief. Small visits, moments where she introduced the baby to the people whose lives the foundation programs were helping. Students receiving scholarships often gathered around curiously. Community leaders admired the child. And Imani noticed something powerful happening during those interactions. People didn't just see her as a successful investor anymore. They saw her as a mother building a future not only for her own child, but for countless others. The Rhodes Legacy Foundation expanded steadily during this time. New educational grants launched across multiple school districts. Financial literacy programs began operating in community centers across Georgia. Small business mentorship programs helped young entrepreneurs gain access to resources they previously lacked. And everywhere Imani traveled, Nia often came with her. The child's laughter became a familiar sound in meeting rooms and community events alike. It reminded everyone present that the work being done wasn't just about numbers or investment returns. It was about future generations. Despite the responsibilities surrounding her growing influence, Imani maintained the simple routines her mother once practiced. Sunday mornings remained dedicated to church. Nia wore tiny dresses while sitting beside her mother during services at New Hope Baptist. Members of the congregation adored her. Afterward, families gathered outside under the Georgia sun, just like they had during Imani's childhood. Those moments grounded her. They reminded her where everything had started, and they ensured that no amount of success could disconnect her from the community that had raised her. Meanwhile, Atlanta's financial circles continued discussing the rise of Rhodes Capital and the growing influence of the Rhodes Legacy Foundation. Executives who once overlooked Imani now requested meetings regularly. But her priorities had shifted. The woman who once fought to prove her value inside someone else's world now focused on building something stronger, a life rooted in purpose, a legacy built through opportunity, and a future centered around the small child who had already transformed her heart. For the first time in years, peace became part of Imani's daily life. Not perfect peace. Life still carried challenges. But the foundation of her world now rested on something far more stable than corporate titles or social status. It rested on family, and on the lessons Loretta Rhodes had planted long before the world ever noticed her daughter's strength. Yet life still had one more unexpected chapter waiting. Because during a meeting about one of Atlanta's largest redevelopment projects, Imani would soon encounter someone whose presence felt refreshingly unfamiliar. Someone who saw her not as a scandal survivor, not as a powerful investor, but simply as a person worth knowing. The meeting took place inside a renovated warehouse near Atlanta's Beltline district. The building had recently been converted into a planning center for one of the city's largest redevelopment initiatives. Urban planners, investors, architects, and community representatives gathered around large tables filled with blueprints and digital renderings. The project aimed to transform several neglected industrial blocks into mixed-use housing, public parks, and commercial spaces. Rhodes Capital had recently acquired a major equity position supporting the redevelopment. Imani attended the meeting to review the architectural plans before final approval. Nia spent the afternoon with Loretta's sister nearby. For the first time in weeks, Imani entered a professional meeting without a stroller or diaper bag. As the discussion began, the lead architect stepped forward to present the design proposal. "Thank you all for coming," he said, while adjusting the digital projection behind him. "My name is Declan Hayes." His accent carried a hint of Midwestern rhythm. "Chicago." The name appeared across the presentation screen beside his firm's logo. Declan Hayes had built a strong reputation for urban redevelopment projects that combined architectural innovation with community preservation. Tall and composed, he spoke with calm clarity, while guiding the group through the design concepts. Images of landscaped walkways appeared on the screen. Affordable housing units integrated with modern retail spaces. Public gathering areas designed to encourage neighborhood interaction. Unlike many presentations that focused only on financial returns, Declan emphasized something else: community impact. These spaces need to serve the people who already live here, he explained. Development should add opportunity without erasing history. Imani listened carefully. His perspective immediately stood out. Many architects in high-budget projects focused primarily on aesthetics or investor expectations. Declan's approach balanced design with long-term neighborhood sustainability. When the presentation ended, the room opened for questions. Imani spoke first. How do you plan to protect existing local businesses during construction? Declan turned toward her. The project includes temporary relocation support and priority placement once the new spaces open. He paused briefly. Economic displacement defeats the purpose of community redevelopment. Imani nodded thoughtfully. Their discussion continued for several minutes. They exchanged ideas about investment timelines, urban infrastructure, long-term economic stability for local residents. The conversation felt different from typical business meetings. Instead of negotiation or competition, it felt collaborative. Two people focused on building something meaningful. After the meeting ended, Declan approached her near the blueprint table. I appreciate your questions, he said. Most investors focus on short-term returns. Imani smiled slightly. Short-term thinking usually creates long-term problems. Declan laughed softly. That's exactly what I've been trying to explain to developers for years. The conversation continued naturally. They discussed Atlanta's rapid growth, urban planning challenges, community preservation. There was no immediate romantic tension, no dramatic moment, just intellectual connection, the kind built through shared curiosity and mutual respect. As they walked toward the exit, Declan glanced at the skyline visible through the warehouse windows. Atlanta reminds me of Chicago 20 years ago, he said. Full of opportunity, but still deciding what kind of city it wants to become. Imani followed his gaze. That decision depends on the people shaping it. Declan looked back at her. And it seems like you're one of them. For the first time in a long while, Imani felt something unfamiliar. Not pressure, not expectation, just interest. And sometimes, the most meaningful relationships begin not with dramatic attraction, but with two minds recognizing each other across a shared vision for the future. The connection between Imani Rhodes and Declan Hayes did not rush forward. After everything Imani had experienced, rushing was not something she allowed anymore. Their relationship developed slowly, built on conversation long before emotion. The redevelopment project along the Beltline created frequent reasons for them to meet. Planning sessions, community forums, investor briefings. Each meeting added another layer of understanding between them. Declan quickly realized that working with Imani was unlike collaborating with most investors. She didn't approach projects purely through financial projections. She asked questions about long-term impact, about neighborhood preservation, about how design decisions would affect families who had lived in those areas for generations. One afternoon after a site visit, they walked along the unfinished section of the Beltline Trail. Construction equipment rested quietly nearby, while workers prepared the next stage of development. Declan studied the surrounding neighborhood. You know, he said thoughtfully, most investors want the fastest possible return. Imani smiled slightly. Fast decisions often create expensive mistakes. He nodded. That's why I enjoy working with you. Their conversations often moved beyond architecture or investment. They talked about childhood memories, about cities that shaped them. Declan described growing up in Chicago, surrounded by historic neighborhoods constantly evolving. Imani shared stories about West End Atlanta, church gatherings, front porch conversations, the community her mother had built around them. When she spoke about Loretta Rhodes, Declan listened with genuine attention. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to compare the story to his own experiences. He simply respected the importance of those memories. And that quiet respect meant more than dramatic gestures ever could. Over time, their meetings became less formal. Coffee after project briefings, dinner discussions about urban development ideas, walks through neighborhoods the redevelopment plan hoped to strengthen. There was no pressure, no expectation, just two people gradually learning about each other's values. Imani noticed something important during those months. Declan never treated her success as something intimidating, but he never attempted to diminish it either. He respected it. One evening they sat outside a small restaurant near Midtown after a long day of meetings. The city lights reflected off nearby buildings, while a gentle breeze moved through the street. Imani watched people walking past for a moment before speaking. "You know, my life hasn't exactly followed a simple path." Declan nodded. "I've read enough headlines to understand that." She laughed softly. "Headlines rarely explain the real story." "I believe that." She studied his expression carefully. "You're not worried about the attention that comes with being around someone in my position?" Declan leaned back slightly. "Why would I be? Some people find it uncomfortable." He shook his head calmly. "Your influence isn't something I need to compete with." She raised an eyebrow. "Compete?" Declan looked at her with complete sincerity. "I don't want to compete with your power." He paused briefly. "I want to build beside it." The words settled quietly between them. There was no dramatic declaration, no overwhelming emotion, just honesty. And for Imani, that honesty felt refreshing. Because for the first time since her marriage to Graham Whitmore ended, she felt something she had once believed might be impossible again. Trust. Not the blind trust that ignores warning signs, but the careful trust that grows through respect and shared purpose. Their relationship continued evolving at its own pace. Declan met Nia several months later during a community event hosted by the Rhodes Legacy Foundation. The little girl sat comfortably in her mother's arms while observing the world with curious eyes. Declan knelt slightly to greet her. "Well, hello there," he said softly. Nia responded with a wide smile. Imani watched the moment quietly. Another small piece of trust settling into place. Because this connection wasn't built on status. It wasn't built on social expectations. It was built on something far more stable, mutual respect, and the belief that two people could create something meaningful together without losing themselves in the process. For Imani Rhodes, that realization felt like the beginning of a different kind of love, one rooted in balance rather than power. Several years after the events that once shook Atlanta's corporate world, Imani Rhodes walked along a quiet path in the West End neighborhood where her story began. The afternoon sun filtered through tall oak trees lining the sidewalk. Children played in a nearby park. Neighbors greeted each other across front porches, just as they had when she was growing up. Beside her walked a small child holding her hand, Nia, now old enough to run ahead occasionally before circling back with excited energy. "Mommy, look," Nia called while pointing toward a group of butterflies near the garden beds. Imani smiled. "I see them." They continued walking slowly through the neighborhood. Over the years, much had changed. The Rhodes Legacy Foundation had expanded programs across several states. Scholarship recipients had graduated from universities. Community development projects had transformed neglected blocks into thriving spaces for small businesses. Rhodes Capital had become one of the most respected investment groups in the region. But despite all that success, Imani still returned regularly to the same streets where Loretta Rhodes had raised her. Because those streets held something money could never replace: perspective. As they approached New Hope Baptist Church, the familiar red brick building stood exactly where it always had. Sunday services still filled the sanctuary with music and voices lifted in praise. Members of the congregation greeted Imani warmly whenever she visited. Many of them remembered Loretta, and now they watched the next generation growing. Nia tugged gently on her mother's hand. "Can we sit for a minute?" Imani nodded. They moved toward a wooden bench beneath a large magnolia tree. Nia climbed onto the seat while swinging her legs happily. For a moment, Imani simply watched her daughter. Bright eyes, endless curiosity, a future still wide open. Her thoughts drifted back through the years. The cemetery, the humiliation, the moment she believed everything had collapsed. At the time, she couldn't see beyond the pain, but now she understood something her mother had known all along. Life doesn't always reward the loudest voices. It often rewards patience. Loretta Rhodes had built her entire philosophy around that belief. Quiet preparation, careful decisions, strength that didn't require validation from others. Imani looked up at the sky through the tree branches. "Grandma would love seeing you," she said softly. Nia tilted her head. Tell me about her again. Imani smiled gently. She was the smartest woman I ever knew. Did she build the foundation? In a way, yes. Nia leaned closer with curiosity. How? Imani thought for a moment before answering. She believed in helping people grow stronger. The child nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like you. Imani laughed quietly. Maybe she taught me well. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while. Across the street, neighbors waved as they passed by. Some recognized Imani as the investor who had helped transform Atlanta's economic landscape. Others remembered her simply as Loretta's daughter. Both identities felt equally meaningful, because the journey that brought her here had never been about proving someone wrong. It had been about honoring the values that shaped her. As Nia ran ahead toward the park again, Imani followed slowly. And in that peaceful moment, she finally felt the full circle of her story. The young girl raised in a modest house in West End Atlanta had grown into a woman capable of shaping cities, all because one quiet mother believed preparation mattered more than recognition. Stories like this one stay with us long after the final scene fades. Not because of wealth, not because of scandal, but because they reveal something deeper about human strength. The journey of Imani Rhodes began with love, faced betrayal, endured humiliation, and ultimately discovered something far greater than revenge: dignity. Her story reminds us that respect inside relationships is not optional. It is essential. Love that requires someone to shrink themselves is not love. It is control. True partnership supports growth. It celebrates the strengths each person brings. And when that respect disappears, the healthiest response is often the hardest one: walking away. Imani also demonstrated another powerful truth. Financial independence changes everything. Loretta Rhodes understood this lesson long before her daughter faced the challenges ahead. By building wealth quietly and teaching Imani how money works, she ensured her daughter would never remain trapped by someone else's decisions. Knowledge creates freedom, and freedom allows people to choose dignity even during painful moments. Cultural pride also played a powerful role in this story. Imani never abandoned the community that raised her. West End Atlanta, New Hope Baptist Church, the neighbors who stood beside her when life felt overwhelming. Those roots remained central to her success. They reminded her who she was long before headlines tried to define her identity. And perhaps the most important lesson comes from the idea of quiet power. The world often celebrates loud victories, public confrontations, dramatic revenge. But Loretta Rhodes taught her daughter something different. Strength grows quietly. Preparation happens without applause. And when the moment finally arrives, the results speak louder than any argument ever could. Imani never needed to destroy Graham Whitmore to prove her worth. She simply built a life strong enough that the truth revealed itself naturally. That kind of strength cannot be taken away, because it lives within the person who carries it. And now the question turns to you. What part of this story spoke to you the most? Was it the courage to walk away from disrespect, the power of financial independence, the importance of honoring where you come from, or the reminder that quiet strength can reshape an entire future? If this story moved you, remember one simple truth: dignity will always outlast humiliation, and preparation will always outlast arrogance. Before we end, bestie, one last thing. If you believe dignity is stronger than revenge, like and subscribe for more powerful stories.